It is now time for your spotlight, and now I'm Kimberly De Souza. Now, the Minister of Finance would have announced that coming on April 19th is an increase in motor fuel prices. And on the line with me, just to understand exactly the implications this could have on our economy, is Mr. Antonio Ross. Of course, Mr. Ross is an oil and gas consultant. Mr. Ross, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us on Now.
Hi, good morning, Kimberly. Good morning to all the viewers. It's a pleasure to be here this morning.
Now, Mr. Ross, I mean, the minister announced this price increase for, I think it's $1 more for prices at the pump, right? It's going to be 50 cents more for diesel. It's going to be $1 more for premium and super gases. I mean, many are questioning the timing of this announcement since we're now coming out of the pandemic, and of course, the economy is now beginning to recover. Was the timing, appropriate? I mean, was this the best time to announce an increase in prices?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that a subsidy is government support, and it is a cost to taxpayers. It also does not generate revenue for the country. There is no good timing for that removal. I mean, no matter what was done, the timing would have said to be inappropriate. But if you do look at the date when it was announced, it is exactly 1 year to the date when the last increase was given, and there's an expectation that these increases will be taking place as time go by due to the removal of the subsidy. So there's no good timing for something like this, but it has to be done.
Right. Now, one of the reasons the minister gave for the increase in prices was also the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And of course, because our economy is recovering. But as we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, we're also seeing that, people have lost their jobs, and some may also be going back to the job market to get jobs. I mean, is there a balancing act that the minister or the government could have done rather than to, decrease the subsidy and increase the prices?
Well, I still would like to reiterate that it's not a price hike and it's not a price increase. It's a removal of government support for the price, which is two totally different things. I would also like to note that, yes, we are recovering through this pandemic, but government has not laid off a single public servant and none of the salaries have been cut. Yes, unfortunately, a few of our citizens have lost their jobs. And as I've said before, there is no good time for something like this, but it is still fair in terms of removing that support because of what the cost is to taxpayers. And of course, to not give financial support to those who have large luxury vehicles, because technically those are the greater beneficiaries of this subsidy that's been ongoing for decades, essentially. And this money can then be channeled, for example, into social support services and revenue generating projects such as incentives to small and medium business enterprises. It's a large amount of money. It's at the tune of around $1 billion, and it can be utilized elsewhere and removed from government expenditure in order to balance the budget.
Right. Now, Mr. Ross, one of the things the minister said was that, in 2019, before the pandemic, consumers would have spent in excess of $1 billion in fuel. And now that the economy is opening back up, they expect it's going to cost more because the price of oil has increased. But is this a fair assessment to make based on 2019 to now and the fact that people may have lost their jobs and they may not be using public transportation as they should?
Well, it's not just an assessment, but it's a fact-based calculation on the cost to citizens. It's a cost to citizens to maintain pricing support for fuel. Keeping in mind that we are still spending $850 million in subsidies in 2022. So this is not even a full removal of that pricing support. It's a partial removal. And yes, the economy is still recovering, but still not fully recovered. Hence, they need to cut this expenditure by way of subsidy reduction. I mean, people have lost their jobs, and I mean, I empathize with those who have. And it's critical that we get back to the point where we could generate revenue, generate jobs. And of course, this money could be redirected for that purpose. But I still also want to point out that perhaps we also need to recalibrate our own taste for champagne and instead settle for Morbi. A PTSC bus, for example, from San Fernando to Port of Spain is moving every single hour, and it's actually $6 on that trip. We have comfortable buses, etc. The water taxi is already subsidized. The Tobago A and C bridge is subsidized, and we cannot continue to run the nation on subsidies paid for by the same people it's meant to assist. The subsidy is, in fact, money obtained via taxation that is being utilized to support fuel prices at the pump.
Now, Mr. Ross, one of the things the minister also mentioned was the fact that the cost to the government of this $2.12 billion fuel subsidy will be reduced by the application of a petroleum production levy. But wouldn't this be enough to cover the cost, or at least a partial cost of the fuel subsidy?
Well, it is already covering a partial cost. For example, $2.1 billion was mentioned in fuel subsidy. However, that petroleum production levy only brings in $435 million, leaving the cost to taxpayers, and I want to stress the cost to taxpayers of $1.69 billion in order to support the fuel subsidy. That $1.69 billion can be best spent elsewhere. The petroleum production levy, for those who may not know, is a tax paid by those who produce oil in Trinidad and Tobago, and it's paid as a percentage of their total production, which is directly utilized to subsidize consumer petroleum products such as fuel. That is only $435 million, yet the full value of the subsidy is $2.12 billion. So it is still insufficient.
Now, as we look across the seas, Mr. Ross, to the invasion of Ukraine, of course, from Russia, I mean, how will this affect the supply chain? And of course, how will this affect us here in TNT?
Well, I mean, it's already affecting us positively in one way, in that oil prices are going up. However, we are negatively affected because the price of fuel is also going up. The greater impact is also that the Black Sea, where most of the sunflower seed oil, which is what we use as cooking oil here, as well as wheat, which we use for production of flour, is trapped in that zone. And therefore, there's limited supplies available globally, including in Africa and other places where hunger and starvation is already taking place. We, fortunately, are not in that place and will never, most likely, ever get to that place. But the effect of that war in Ukraine is supply chain disruptions, as well as cost of transportation, which is logistics. Every time you move goods, we are a small island in the Caribbean, 2,000 square miles in size, with a population of 1.4 million people. Globally, almost every good that we receive has to be shipped in. Shipping cost is going up. The cost of fuel for those ships is going up. And therefore, the cost of goods landed in Trinidad is and will continue to go up to some point and to some extent because of this war in Ukraine.
Now, Mr. Ross, the minister, he defended the decision to raise the fuel prices by doing a comparison of other fuel prices in the region. But I know some sectors were actually saying, well, we may not be able to compare because we don't know exactly how much, they spend in travel each year or the size of the population. I mean, do you think this is a fair assessment to make in terms of the fact that we seem to be the second lowest in the region in terms of fuel prices?
That rubric that you put up there is a fact. So, I mean, facts are fairly inescapable. At the same time, we keep using all these other pieces and bits and pieces of information without recognizing that the issue is that we are taking tax dollars to support fuel prices, and that is what actually has to stop. Whatever is going on in the other regions matters when we make some measure of comparison, but it's not a clear-cut comparison at all, because at the end of the day, many of the things that citizens and groups are pointing out are different in those islands has nothing to do with the price of fuel. The price of fuel is tied to commodity prices, and we need to get back to where we are pricing to market and utilizing the funds that we are using as a subsidy for relief to the lower income earners and also for revenue generation. The key being revenue generation, as opposed to just spending money and not using that money to reinvest and make money. A subsidy is not an investment. We need to invest that $1.something billion into generating more money and increasing the revenues of Trinidad and Tobago. a subsidy is not revenue generating.
Now, Mr. Ross, I know you keep mentioning, the timing, and there could be no timing in doing this. But the minister also announced the liberalization, rather, of the fuel prices. And I'm just wondering, when this comes into effect with the removal of the subsidy, I mean, is it that consumers are going to have to pay more, or is it that they might be taken advantage of when they go to certain pumps?
Well, the thing is, I mean, we can't want to live in a capitalist society and still want to behave like socialists. Okay? Yes, liberalization has its negative effects, but I would like to believe that when all is said and done, the money that would be removed from that fuel subsidy would be utilized to make a better society. In the case of this particular liberalization, the price will be based on the up and down movement of oil and gas. For example, as it stands, what if, let's create a scenario of what if the price of oil goes down to $30 a barrel? Then obviously the price of fuel will also drop on the wholesale market, and then the sellers at the pump would sell with a slight markup, and it would still then be lower than it is today. So it has its upside and downsides, just like the United States, just like in Europe, where prices fluctuate based on the price of oil on the open market with a markup by the sellers at the pump.
Right. Now, Mr. Ross, one of the things the minister also mentioned is that the highest subsidy levels are on LPG and kerosene at this time, but there remains substantial subsidy on fuels used in transportation, yet LPG stayed the same price and fuel increased. What do you think was the reasoning for this?
Well, I mean, LPG directly affects everyone under the pot, right? Every household, including and especially the unemployed and low-income earners, and I suspect that this was done in order to remain, so that they would remain untouched in this scenario. So that's a very good move by the government, and I applaud a move like that, and it shows that they are sensitive to the needs of the population.
Now, Mr. Ross, we have spent the most time talking about some of the negative effects, or the effects that might be, funded or felt by the consumers. What are some of the positive effects, for the removal of this subsidy? Are there any positive effects?
Well, the positive effects are limited. However, at the end of the day, it now becomes an open market. People still have the option to make choices. And I believe one of the positive effects should be in collaboration with PTSC, that PTSC, for example, need to get more digitized, for example, where we should be able to go on an app and be able to see the movement of buses and the bus times, etc. But here is an opportunity for us to improve on the public transport service, utilizing some of those funds as well. So that is a positive effect. Also, the reduction in the burning of fossil fuels, that's a positive effect on the environment. There's also the additional positive effect of moving towards electric vehicles, another positive effect. Yeah. So yes, there are several positive effects of this that we need to take advantage of moving into the future. Nice. And I would dare say and stress that we need to look at the PTSC as an option. It is not a bad thing. We need to basically come down from where we are and recognize that, hey, we do have good public transport service in Trinidad and Tobago.
Now, Mr. Ross, we have about a few seconds left. Any final closing thoughts before we wrap the interview?
We cannot have more taxes and expect to drink champagne with that money. We need to also not be too stush, ride the PTSC buses. The government provides subsidies for those, the water taxis, as well as the sea and air bridge. And that's my closing remark.
Mr. Ross, thank you so much for coming and just enlightening us on the increase, some of the positives, of course, and some of the negatives that we can see with the fuel increase. Well, the removal of the subsidy, as you reminded me. So thank you so much for joining us on Now.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.
You too. And that was Mr. Ross. He's an oil and gas consultant, just giving us, a breakdown of some of the implications for the removal of the fuel subsidy that the Minister of Finance announced last week. You're on the Now Morning Show. We're going to take a break, and we'll be right back. Stay with us.